My dad once traveled through northern Mexico with some of his siblings and their spouses. They stopped somewhere to sleep for one night and had a chilling encounter. I don't remember the exact room layout, but my dad did say that several of the beds were placed next to each other. They used those thick Mexican striped blankets due to the low temperatures up in the mountains. He woke up in the middle of the night and felt the coldest sensation he'd ever experienced running down his back before one of my aunts started screaming. Someone turned on the light to find my aunt sitting up and crying in bed. There was a huge chunk of her hair missing. When they looked underneath her bed, they found her hair just lying on the floor. My dad says she was in the middle of the beds, so no one could figure out what happened until she calmed down somewhat. Apparently, she woke up and felt a big hand with long fingernails pulling on her hair. They didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, the owner asked the group if they had paid a visit the previous night. My grandmother is getting pretty old now, so she tells this story more often than she used to. Back in the 60s, she took her 3 young kids and left her abusive husband. The only house she could afford to rent at first was a ramshackle 4-room farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It didn't even have indoor plumbing, just an outhouse and a well out back where they drew water. According to her and my mother, every night around 2 a.m., they would hear the back door into the kitchen unlock and open. It was an old door, and both those actions had very distinctive, unmistakable sounds. They would then hear heavy footsteps walk across the creaky kitchen floor to the water bucket, and the water dipper would rattle against the bucket, like someone was dipping out a drink of water. And then nothing. It scared the life out of her, of course. But once she ascertained that no one was breaking and entering, so there was no one to shoot, she settled down. In her eyes, whatever was happening, it wasn't harmful. My mom, on the other hand, was the only kid old enough to really understand what was happening, and it freaked her out. So my grandmother decided to get her sister, my great-aunt Sue, to stay over one night. They planned to sit up and see what the hell was going on. My mom wasn't going to join them, but she couldn't sleep and felt safer in the room with them. So she was there as well when 2 o'clock rolled around. They were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when they heard the back door unlock and swing open. The thing is, they were staring straight at it, and it didn't move. Same with the footsteps and the water dipper. They saw nothing, even though they could hear it clearly, even discern the direction of the noises. That was pretty much that. It kept happening every night. They didn't stay in that house long because my grandmother found a job and a better rental closer to town, and my mom was super happy to get out of there. So my grandmother still talks about it sometimes, and it's strangely hilarious because she's so unbothered by it. I mean, I would pee my pants. But the last time I asked her why it didn't scare her, she said, "Well, heck, he was just thirsty." Years ago, a young couple from our village built a house close to a well-known fairy tree. In Irish folklore, fairy trees are steeped in superstition, and people tend to avoid them, let alone cut them down. During the construction of their house, the couple damaged a part of the tree but didn't kill it. Many locals warned them about the consequences, but they dismissed it as mere superstition. Shortly after moving into the house, they began to notice someone watching their home. Whenever they rushed outside to confront the person, they had vanished. They attributed this to children playing pranks, and eventually, the unsettling incidents ceased. A year or 2 later, the couple welcomed a baby boy. Wanting to have their first night out together, they hired a local girl as a babysitter. When she arrived, everything appeared normal, and the couple set out for a nearby pub to enjoy some live music. As the evening progressed, the baby's cries began. The babysitter tried to soothe him, returning him to his crib and going back to watching TV. Gradually, the cries intensified, and the baby took longer to settle down. The babysitter grew increasingly anxious, but she was helpless. There was no phone in the house, and she didn't know the pub's number. At one point, the baby's cries reached an unnatural pitch, becoming exceedingly loud. The babysitter entered the room And as she looked into the crib, she was horrified to see the baby with the face of an old man. Startled, she leaped back and noticed someone standing in the corner of the room, not much taller than a child, but immensely frightening. In sheer panic, she fled from the room and the house, running to the neighbor's home to recount her chilling experience. The neighbors returned to the house, fearing that whoever was in the room might have sinister intentions towards the baby. When they entered, the baby was crying, and even the neighbors sensed an eerie presence. One of them rushed to the house and called the priest, the go-to authority in times of crisis in Ireland. The priest arrived promptly and performed a blessing on the house and the child. Afterward, everyone felt at ease, and the house regained its calm, except for the babysitter, who wanted nothing more than to return home. Upon their return, the couple was astounded to find so many people in their house. The priest explained the situation but offered little advice. Their neighbors informed them that it was the fairies' doing, and that they needed to make amends for the harm done to the tree. From then on, the couple left out offerings for the fairies, such as food, drinks, and coins, and they were never troubled again. My grandmother always tells the story of the man in the yellow coat. He knocked on the door of her and my grandfather's home one day. They were a young couple at the time. He was European. She's not exactly sure what nationality, but he was wearing a yellow coat. Being religious and the kind of people who will always help others, they invited him in for tea, asked him about himself, etc. He wouldn't give much away. The second time he appeared unannounced at the front door. My grandparents already had friends over, but invited him to stay anyway. As soon as he came into the room, everyone there started trying to find excuses to leave the room or not look this man in the eyes. One by one, everyone left the room until he was the only one left there. When they talked about it later, each person felt an indescribable fear when around this man in the yellow coat, like he had this sinister aura. From then on, my grandparents tried to find excuses not to be around him, even though he continued knocking on the door from time to time for seemingly no reason. One day, my grandmother collected the mail and found a handwritten letter from him, saying that he was going to harm them both, my grandparents, that he would not stop even if they cried and begged him to, and how they would both face consequences. Naturally, my grandmother was terrified, and even though he never followed through on his threat, she would occasionally see him walking around town in his yellow coat and remember it all over again. When my dad was 18, his father, my grandfather, fell seriously ill and became bedridden. One evening, my dad was sitting by his father's bedside, discussing various tasks that needed attention on the farm. After chatting for a while, my grandfather made an unusual request. He asked my dad if he could fetch a bottle of whiskey that he had stashed in the dairy, a small milking parlor adjacent to the main house. It was likely hidden there from my grandmother, who had a penchant for being quite generous with the whiskey when guests were around. My father obliged and headed out to the dairy, tasked with locating this hidden bottle of whiskey. The dairy had only one small window at the back, offering a limited view of the farm. Right outside that window was a pit where all the cow manure from the winter was stored. Stepping into that pit would mean sinking immediately and facing a grim suffocation. As my father was searching for the whiskey, he heard a series of 3 loud and forceful knocks on the window. The knocks were heavy enough that they could have shattered the window pane. He froze in place because he knew there was absolutely no way anyone could have knocked on that window, given its location and surroundings. After a few moments, he snapped out of his shock and realized what he had heard. 3 distinct knocks, which he recognized as the ominous death knocks of the banshee. In Irish folklore, these knocks were considered an omen that signified the impending death of someone close to you. Without wasting another moment, my father rushed back into the house and up to his father's room. There, he made a somber discovery. His father had passed away. His hands were clasped together as if in prayer. My dad believes that his father knew what was coming but didn't want him in the room to experience it. He shared that his father had been in considerable pain that day. Strangely, despite his extensive search, my dad never did find that elusive bottle of whiskey.